hated list. Now, you heard what he said about Samir Khan. Just imagine what Samir Khan would say about Aaron. Our last speaker, and he saves the best for the end, is Mr. Lee Smith, and thank you for your patience. Mr. Lee Smith is a visiting scholar at the Hudson Institute. He has led an impressive career in writing and publishing articles in numerous, I can't even list them all, journals and magazines and publications. Has been a guest speaker at different radio and television programs, published articles in New York Times, the New York Republic, which is it's a long list. Really, trust me. And his last book, just published in January 2010, The Strongholds of Power Politics and the Clash of Arab Civilization. So, the floor is yours, last 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor.
I want to use my 20 minutes of time, even though I'm going last. I come from, I don't do work in counterterrorism, nor do I do work in terrorism. I'm coming from I come from the media side of the equation, and yes, I work at the Weekly Standard. I'm a senior editor at the Weekly Standard. I also have a weekly column at Tablet Magazine, which is a website. And so I am actually part of the new media, and that's basically what I'm going to speak about today. One reason for the surge of public criticism of Israel over the last decade is the increasing interest of American media consumers in the Middle East as the United States' involvement in the region deepened after 9/11. The other reason is the triumph of the medium of the Internet, which lends itself to anti-Semitic narratives. The Internet does not just publish conspiracy theories, it is often structured like one. After all, the genius of the web is its interconnectedness, or the facility with which it is capable of making links based on other links, allowing a chain of unbroken and unsubstantiated rumor and innuendo to acquire the stature of fact. I want to focus today on what's neither terrorism nor counterterrorism strategy, but is rather a new media business model, and that is the mainstreaming of anti-Israel narratives, especially through blogs, some of them owned by very large and well-known U.S. media organizations like the Washington Post Company and the New York Times. On these blogs, the use of certain themes and code words like Israel lobby, anti-Zionist, dual loyalty, neocon, Likud, etc., serve as a kind of dog whistle that summons an audience from all across the Internet. These narratives and tropes that are manipulated to drive web traffic create a space in the U.S. media for what are ostensibly anti-Zionist arguments that have instead mainstreamed anti-Semitism, sometimes unwittingly and sometimes not at all. For the purposes of counterterrorism, the larger issue is that these anti-Israel narratives are serving the purpose of delegitimizing Israel in its fight against its terrorist enemies. Perhaps some of you have seen Time Magazine's cover from 2 weeks ago, why Israelis don't care about peace, while the cover image of a Star of David composed of presumably ironic daisies reminded many observers of the similarities between that cover and Time's 1977 cover with the Star of David made of rifles and a photo of the recently elected Menachem Begin. I'm going to argue that this cover from 2 weeks ago really needs to be understood in the context of the contemporary media climate. Time, after all, was founded as a news weekly, a media model that is unworkable and unprofitable in today's media climate, with a 24-hour news cycle that is further saturated by the sheer volume of information. Accordingly, a few years ago, Time decided to abandon the news weekly format and devoted its pages to commentary on the news. As Time, along with other news weeklies, discovered, such as Newsweek, this was hardly a recipe for financial success. The U.S. media is reeling. For instance, New York Times staffers recently took a 5% pay cut after 100 of their colleagues were laid off. And yet, compared to their colleagues at the Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune, both of which have been gutted after sliding into bankruptcy, journalists at the Times are clearly lucky. None of the big media companies have figured out how to make their internet presence into a profit center that can sustain operations, even as they turn their hallowed brand names over to opinion bloggers who can generate copy at a tiny fraction of the cost of traditional reporting. You see this especially at places like the Washington Post Company, and some of you may be familiar with the recent journalist scandal, which was basically about a number of opinion bloggers who've been hired at the Washington Post, and we compare what it costs to have opinion bloggers compared to actual foreign bureaus and people doing reporting work, and how much material they can put out. It's astonishing. The Post has reduced its number of foreign bureaus precipitously, and I suspect the Times will very shortly as well. At any rate, the anti-Israel market is one of the most attractive niche markets in this trade, because it taps into a passionate audience that is interested in news and can generate immediate and measurable results, as in page views, hits, and most especially comments. It is important to note here that there are a lot of different currents feeding into this anti-Semitism that's turning up in the media. Not all of these currents are specifically anti-Semitic, or even knowingly anti-Israel. While some of these trends are explicitly so, and more apt to be found on Nazi and white supremacist sites on the internet, some of it merely derives from what you might call an Arabist perspective, typically associated with academic Middle East experts and certain U.S. policymaking circles, insistent that the U.S., for instance, play a more, quote, honest broker, unquote, role in the Middle East. Yet another stream issues from a far-left anti-American position, which has taken Israel and U.S. policy toward the Jewish state as its new bête noire, replacing U.S. policy in Latin America and before that Vietnam. As is typically the case in U.S. politics, by staking out an extreme position, the far left has described the boundaries of acceptable political discourse, thereby dragging along the liberal mainstream, none of which can at all be described as anything like anti-Semitic. Indeed, after two articles I wrote for Tablet magazine describing how anti-Semitism is being mainstreamed in the new media, a number of colleagues, journalists and editors, rebuked me and were quite upset for what they believed was my facile and dangerous use of the term anti-Semitism. While it is true that they themselves, even the publishers or editors say of Stephen Walt's blog over at foreignpolicy.com, can hardly be called anti-Semitic, the fact remains that in moving the boundaries and helping to move the boundaries of acceptable political and intellectual discourse in the United States media culture, these anti-Israel narratives have helped mainstream anti-Semitism and delegitimize Israel's counter-terrorism efforts. While much current work on anti-Semitism is focused on Europe, the subject has received less attention from the U.S., and yet as far back as 2003, David Brooks, writing in the Weekly Standard, was among the first to note the resurgence of anti-Semitism in polite conversation, as conspiracy theorists peddled the idea that Jewish American officials and their colleagues in the media had pressed the U.S. into making war with Iraq to serve the interests of Israel. I'm sure most of you are fairly familiar with this trend. From blogs and bulletin boards, Jew-baiting soon entered the mainstream publishing industry, most famously with the publication of Walt and John Mearsheimer's The Israel Lobby, its thesis, again, I'm sure you're probably familiar with, is that according to these two authors, there exists a group of American officials, journalists, and activists, including from the New York Times to AIPAC, who have intentionally deceived the U.S. public and subverted true American interests on behalf of the Jewish state. As reviewers noted, the bulk of the book's research was based itself on secondary sources, much of it derived from the internet. And thus, a meme that once festered in the dark places of the internet has now become one of the medium's premier genres. It is not, of course, as popular as X-rated sites or even sports sites, but the anti-Israel blog is becoming more popular and lucrative. It is being adopted by ever more websites, so that it is no longer a fringe affair, but has rather moved into the mainstream avenues of the new media market, where the U.S. media's major names are now taking part, again, including the Washington Post company.